From now on, let's move into something towards which I'm positive you all have been looking. And that's the Focke-Wulf Condor, the FA 200. The name alone conjures up imagery of the Battle of the Atlantic and Arctic convoy raids. She was famous before the war as one of the first civilian land planes designed for transoceanic passenger flights. When Pan Am, Lufthansa, KLM, and the predecessors to BOAC, which were Imperial Airways and British Airways, they focused on seaplanes and flying boats. And Kortank, there's a name to recognize. Kortank proposed that a land plane, which could fly economically at 10,000 feet, just shy of necessitating pressurization, could be fitted with sufficient fuel to make long-distance trips within and beyond the continent. And she took her name from the particularly long wingspan that accommodated her 4 engines, and the first prototype was fitted with auxiliary fuel tanks and made the first non-stop flight between Berlin and New York City. So, a 25-hour flight, she landed, I think it was from Stocken in Berlin. She landed at Floyd Bennett Field, which if you've never been there, go visit, please. And the return trip, I think, was just over 21 hours. Of course, difference in the winds for you. So it was an incredible aircraft. The same one, which, the Fw one, would later fly from Berlin to Basra, then on to Karachi, Hanoi, and finally to Tokyo in another endurance flight. For those of you who enjoyed my video on the Amiot 143, you may recall a similar flight undertaken by that aircraft, the one terminating in Hanoi, and it involved many more stops. The FW200 kind of shows that the FW200 was a technological leap, and it was also an advancement in luxury. Not until the Boeing 307 and the Douglas DC-4 of the early 1940s did passenger flights of similar ranges and similar levels of comfort begin to be common. And of course, these aircraft also flew thousands of feet higher than the 3,000 or 4,000 feet that was the normal cruising altitude at the time. And she began service with not only Lufthansa, but also with her Brazilian subsidiary, Sindicato Condor. She was also put to use by the Danske Luftfartsselskab, which had 2 examples, Dania and Jutlandia. The former was taken by the British after the invasion of Denmark, while the latter served with DDL as a passenger aircraft throughout the war. She made flights to places like neutral Sweden, and she took advantage of Denmark's relative freedom, if you want to call it that. She would end her career when damaged beyond repair in 1946 during a landing at Northolt. It was probably one of the very few passenger flights between the continent and England in that year. Meanwhile, in Brazilian service with Sindicato Condor, that became Serviços Aéreos Cruzeiro do Sul on the 16th of January 1943 when Getúlio Vargas nationalized the airline. While the U-52s in service began to be replaced by Douglas DC-3s, the Condor stayed on. The last one left service in 1947. That was only due to a lack of parts. And another one was lost also in 1947 at the Santos Dumont Airport when she struck a DC-3 also landing. But in the military role, the first one came from a retrofitting of an example which had been destined for Dai Nippon Goku. Now, these were the blueprints for the C-Series, really, and she had hardpoints and defensive machine guns installed, while other Condors remained in the passenger role. They made regular flights to Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and elsewhere, and they had a normal complement of 26 comfortable passengers. Those in a military role could carry up to 2,200 pounds in bombs or mines, and although it had a very rudimentary bomb sight, they were responsible for the loss of over 365,000 tons of Allied shipping. What they would do is fly low level and drop bombs in rapid sequence so at least one would hit the ship and hopefully the others would bracket it. So the normal armament, though, was 4 550-pound bombs, although any reasonable combination could also be carried. However, if the hardpoints were loaded, then her payload increased to almost 12,000 pounds of ordnance. But then the internal bay had to be empty to save weight or to hold auxiliary fuel. Her other role at sea, and one at which she uniquely excelled, was maritime patrol and submarine cooperation. While on land, she was basically in a VIP transport role and in making supply runs, even into the besieged Stalingrad. Now, initially, unlike almost every other example of a German bomber, there was really no push to use her as a military aircraft. Germany was very good at designing passenger aircraft that were really bombers or in pushing civil aircraft into military roles, but this wasn't the case with the Condor. But only days after the war began, Hauptmann Ega Petersen would kind of put an end to that. Now, Hauptmann Petersen was the staff captain of the Erste Staffel Kampfgeschwader 51. He was then assigned as an aide and advisor with the General zur besonderen Verwendung der Luftwaffe 2, also Luftflotte 2. He was notably experienced for just being a Hauptmann, as he had actually served in the Reichswehr's secret air warfare endeavors in Russia in 1929. In fact, that might have been what kind of kept his rank back. Had he not served in Soviet Russia with the German-Russian cooperation, he might have advanced further. But his initial consideration was actually a study of using the U-90 as a long-range maritime aircraft. Now, only 2 were available, and Junkers had really no production facilities equipped to produce it. So he looked at 4 of the FW-200s. These 4 were being completed to be sent to Japan. And instead he took them and formed the Fernaufklärungsstaffel with these 4 as well as 6 standard production examples. And that was on the 1st of October 1939 in Bremen. So the unit also had several, albeit only temporarily so, other kind of attachments, you could say. The Berlin-based high-altitude research flight of the Abklärungsgruppe Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe was another one. So, it wasn't really an offspring. It was more that, as long as these Condors were around, they went there. But they were more concerned with research than active service. Even though it was, called an Aufklärungsgruppe, it was definitely more of a Polbungsgruppe in that sense. And but once Petersen's unit had expanded and he had hand-selected, personally trained crews, it was redesignated of the Erste Staffel Kampfgeschwader 40, entered combat in the invasion in Norway with a strength wavering between 2 and 6 aircraft, hardly a Staffel. Experienced his first combat loss on 25th of May 1940, when one was downed by flying officer Grant Eady in his Gloucester Gladiator of number 263 Squadron over Druya Island, which is in the far northern county of Troms. So, definitely she was vulnerable, to say the least. After the fall of France, a much larger Erste Staffel Kampfgeschwader 40 would operate in close quarters around the British Isles on mine-laying missions and recon flights, and really a bad place to put what is essentially a civil aircraft. It showed her vulnerability to flak, forced the Condor's activities to back off and focus on their more usual routine of armed coastal recon after a loss off the Firth of Forth and another one over Belfast. And with the addition of a second Staffel, Kampfgeschwader 40 definitely grew, and they commenced with convoy activities. And this is where the Condor really shone. So after the Befehl 138 made her debut in the spring of 1941, the Condor was ordered to serve only in a reconnaissance and patrol role. She was not to be a patrol bomber or scout. And ironically, her main enemies would appear only after this change in role. This was the first cam-launched Hurricanes, or the Hurricat if you prefer. They didn't down a Condor until August 1941. The Grumman Martlet, the British designation for the F-4F Wildcat, they didn't become a threat until the first escort carriers put to sea soon thereafter. But notably, she was the first German aircraft shot down by the U.S. Army Air Force when an example was shot down over Iceland in August 1942. It goes to show that the Luftwaffe was able to launch patrols from primary bases in Jutland as late as 1942 that were ranging all the way out to Iceland. Even into taking into account the great arc routes that were used to maximize efficiency, it's a testament to the Condor's capabilities and just sheer ruggedness. By then, her role had also expanded. The C-4 had Rostock search radar added, later upgraded to the Hohenpfeil radar sets, which were much better suited for vessels at sea. Some of them later became anti-shipping missile platforms as the C-6 and C-8 models. They were made to carry the Henschel HS-293 radio-guided rocket-powered missiles. They also were outfitted with Hohenpfeil radar in the case of the C-8. And again, we'll cover more of this much later, but it wasn't really until 1944 that production ceased and her replacement began in earnest, which were Junkers 290s and Heinkel 177s. But this wasn't before the 276 Condors, both civil and military, were produced. They were made with a mix of dorsal turrets, which had 20mm cannon from the C3 model onward, a mix of machine guns and twin lateral, as well as forward gondola, ventral gondola, forward dorsal and aft dorsal locations. These were mostly a rifle caliber, except a single 13mm aft dorsal fitting in many models. And while lauded by many, she had a lot of faults. Not only was she vulnerable, but in just some of her equipment. For example, the dinghies. They had a very finicky self-inflating apparatus that needed to be checked before every flight, lest one, end up depending on manual inflation, which could take almost an hour. If you had the patience to spare, 45 minutes before being faced with hypothermia, drowning, or some other nasty distraction, then have at it. But that's not something you want in a military aircraft operating at sea. I mean, not that it would really matter to crews regularly flying hundreds of miles from home in the North Atlantic. I'm sure the last thing that they worried about was cold water, right? But, I mean, seriously, it was definitely something that needed to be addressed and wasn't. The shift in missions to mine laying meant that the Condors were being lost to land-based fighters and flak. But with Peterson's connections to Luftwaffe Chef de Generalstab Generalmajor Hans-Georg Schoneck, the Kampfgeschwader was able to move to first Belgian and later French bases. They operated with near impunity far out into the Atlantic as long as the Condors stayed far from catapult fighters, escort fighters, heavy flak, or land-based aircraft. So beginning with anti-convoy operations in the summer of 1940 out of Bordeaux and Brest, with fewer than a dozen available at any given time in 1940, the Condor was earning a reputation in the Luftwaffe that far outweighed her small numbers. And Kriegsmarine crews were more than appreciative, as they now had the benefit of airborne recon as far out as 24 degrees west. So to give you an idea, that meant that a Condor could operate right off the coast of Greenland, or if you're going to look south instead of north, past the Ilha de Zon de Galão in Portuguese West Africa. So there's so much more to discuss, but we're going to cover that in later videos, and where operational activity rather than inventory is the focus.